So we've been traveling as a family now full time for over 2 years. We checked out of the Australian 9 to 5 grind and decided that it wasn't the life for us. And we now live in Malaysia. One of the questions we get asked more than anything else is how we handle the education of our two boys who are 9 and 8 years old. And in this video, I'm going to cover off how we do our education, just to give you a few ideas and give you a bit of an explanation of how we go about it. Okay, so educating your children, it's arguably one of the most important things you're going to have to get right if you want to travel like we do. You can't just not educate your kids. And there's a lot of people out there who are not traveling, not because necessarily they don't like the idea or they can't afford to or whatever. It's just they're worried about their kids' education. And I'm going to qualify this by saying, I don't know if we got the right answers. I don't know if what we're doing is the right way to go about it. It's just what we do. And of course, we're open to ideas and we'd love to hear from other people that are doing the same thing. We essentially homeschool our children. So we basically do a combination of what would be considered traditional homeschool with this thing called world schooling. Now, world schooling is essentially the concept of where you let the world teach your children and let the world teach and educate your children on the importance of life, and they'll learn the things they need to learn from the world around them. Now, we don't subscribe wholesale to that. There's a lot of people that travel like this who just don't educate their children at all and let the world do that. We don't necessarily subscribe to that. What we like to think we do is a combination of traditional homeschooling with world schooling attached to it. So what we essentially do is we do traditional homeschooling with English and math. And what that generally entails is starting at 9 in the morning. So what our day looks like with the kids when it comes to education is our day starts at 9 in the morning. So the kids get ready like they would at home. Then 9 o'clock in the morning, they're on their computers ready to start the day. And basically we do 3 to 4 hours a day of homeschooling, which will be a combination of English and math. Sometimes it starts with math, sometimes it starts with English. But what we do is we have 20, 30 minutes of education, and then we give the kids a 10-minute break. Now, what we do in regards to the specific education of our children is we use a combination of a thing called kinetic education, traditional pen and paper system, which is called homeschool in a box, and learning tools like reading eggs. That is like our stack that we use to educate our kids. And effectively what we do is a combination of those three. So we use kinetic education to make sure that we follow the Australian curriculum very closely. So kinetic education is a tutoring system that was designed to help kids who are falling behind in school. Now, one of the added perks of kinetic education is that it's not only designed for kids that are falling behind, it's also designed for kids who are excelling to make sure that they get extra information, they can move faster than the Australian curriculum allows. And that's what we found has happened with our kids, is we use kinetic education is our base for the Australian curriculum because it's aligned with that. They get assessed against that, and then they're given stuff based on that and based where the gaps are in their skill set and where the gaps are in their education. So we do that for an hour or so a day. We do what they suggest that we teach them, and then what we do is we reinforce what they're suggesting that we teach them with reading eggs and this homeschool in a box. So basically the kids do a 50-50 split of time on the computer and time in front of pen and paper doing writing activities, maths activities with pen and paper. Now, let's talk about some of the pros and cons of doing this. Obviously, this isn't a replacement for teachers. Teachers have a very important role that we only understood once we started traveling and teaching our own children. It's one thing to provide them with the information that they need to succeed. It's another thing to get them to do it. And that's what we're learning right now as parents that are teaching our children ourselves, is that you've got to work around our kids. Our kids are not as driven as other kids out there. You know, they're two boys, they'd much rather be playing Roblox. And we are actually quite active in making sure they get everything they need to done. So my wife will sit there and basically concentrate on them for 3 or 4 hours alongside doing odds and ends. But anytime they have a question, she's there to help and explain it and dive deeper and make sure they understand the concepts. And she's there to support that learning the same way a teacher would. I would liken her to being like an education assistant. She obviously isn't replacing what a teacher does in the school setting, because we just don't teach that way either. Now, how has this affected our children? Well, obviously we're only going off the assessments that kinetic education does for us, but if we were to go off the Australian curriculum and basically aligning what our kids know based off the Australian curriculum and what they're supposed to know what year, our kids would be probably a year ahead in math. Like Liam is now doing year 6 math. He's done most of year 5 and he's on to year 6 math. And Riley is in year 3 technically, and he is doing like what I would consider to be like year 4 math and into year 5 math. Take that at a grain of salt, because obviously that's just what kinetic education is telling us, basically aligned from the curriculum. But I've definitely noticed how much more they've learned being on the road because we are moving at their pace than basically what the school system was telling us they knew how to do. So this is definitely nothing against the traditional school system. If we weren't traveling, the boys would be in traditional school. We're not people that have pulled our kids out of the schooling system because we didn't like traditional schooling. It just didn't fit what we wanted to achieve as a family. So what we found when we first started homeschooling our youngest boy, Riley, is that he was incredibly quiet. He still is to this day. He's a little bit more out of his shell now because we've been traveling, but he's a quiet kid. And when we started doing the homeschooling and trying to align him with what the school system said he needed to be at, it was actually a fair bit behind where the traditional school system said he needed to be. Now, I don't know if it was the traditional schooling system. We're just making speculation here, but I think because he was so quiet, he just sort of got left behind because he never spoke up about not knowing how to do things. He was just a quiet boy. And, you know, when you got a class of 30 children, the squeaky wheels get the oil. And I don't know if that's like every school system, but our school had 32 children in his class. And if he's sitting there not making noise, you know, their teachers are focused on the kids that are making the noise and need the most help. So because he didn't speak up, that could have been the reason he fell behind. We spent the first 6-7 months catching him back up, and now he's ahead and we're moving at his pace. And I think that's one of the benefits of teaching your kids yourself, is that you get to move at their pace because there's just less kids. Now, I would argue, are we doing as good a job as a teacher would, a professional teacher that's used to teaching? I don't know. Are we doing a good job? I like to think so. We really do care about the children, and we do put a lot of effort into making sure that they do this properly. We're not just plonking them in front of a computer and letting the computer teach them, if that makes sense. Now, let's talk about, that's obviously some of the pros of what we're doing. Let's talk about some of the cons. I think one of the biggest cons with the way we're teaching our kids is that they're getting way too much screen time right now. So the screen time is a big issue because like our education is based around computers. They're spending a lot of time in front of computers. I don't think that's necessarily as bad a thing as other people make it out because they're getting really good with using computers, but they get a lot of screen time and it's hard to balance that considering their whole education relies heavily on computers. Probably like that at school, traditional schooling these days too, but like we do try and balance that with pen and paper stuff and things like that. I think also the other con is that, you know, we are parents at the end of the day and not teachers. So we're putting a lot of faith in systems like Kinetic and stuff like that to make sure that we're providing the best education possible. We don't necessarily know if that's the right approach. What we're doing is follow the Australian curriculum, following the West Australian curriculum and following it verbatim. And that seems to be a pretty good approach to the education side. Again, we don't know though. So we're just really, the time will tell when they go back to traditional schooling whether we've made the right decision or not. And that's a massive con because as a parent, that creates a lot of anxiety. Now, you're probably wondering, what about science? What about social studies? What about geography? What about all the other ancillary topics? Well, that's an interesting one because we get asked this a lot, and basically we just focus on English and math because we feel like those are the most important topics from a practical sit down and learn how to read, write, arithmetic, things like that. That's where we prescribe to the world schooling element of this. We do honestly believe that our kids are learning a lot about the world by just being in it and being around it. Geography, the different countries that we're in. You know, I could go on and on. I mean, it's pretty straightforward that traveling around the world and Southeast Asia tends to give kids a more practical exposure to social studies, geography, science, and all that as well. Now, there is obviously gaps in what they do. So what we try and do is we make a conscious effort to when we go to countries to like go and visit museums, go and visit places where they can reinforce the education they're getting from a world schooling perspective. And I'm a big learner as well. I love learning about things. So when we go to a museum or we go to a science museum, say in South Korea, we went to several science museums. When we go there, I prep the boys. Like I go in there and I try and be as excited as possible about learning things. And I'm constantly with the boys next to them going, oh, how amazing is that? How amazing is that static electricity is going from that ball to your hands? And then we just have lots of conversations about different concepts. So the other day there was lightning here and it was raining really heavy and the boys just asked a lot of questions about the lightning and about the thunder and about the rain. And one of the boys asked, like, why is the rain so fat here? Like, why is the rain so hard? Then I spent about 20 minutes explaining about how we're close to the tropics, the equator, and because we're closer to the equator, it rains more. So I do feel like there's a bit of a gap in their science and social studies and things like that, but it's not a gap that's insurmountable. And that's the most important thing. So from an education perspective, I think at the end of the day, we don't necessarily know if we've done the right thing or not, but only time will tell. I like to think that we've doing a pretty good job of it. And I like to think if they went back to traditional schooling, they would be pretty well equipped to handle it. Now, how were we able to pull our children out of school and go traveling like this? Well, I'm not exactly sure where you're watching this from, but in Australia, it's quite a unique situation. Australia is broken up into states, obviously, and each state has its own schooling system. In Australia, each state is governed by the state government. Education is governed by the state government. And because we're not in Western Australia doesn't care about us. And because we're not in another state doesn't care about us. We kind of fall into this gap. Like, I would call it a loophole, but it's a gap. We don't have to register our kids anywhere because we're not in any state. We're not in Australia. Now, the thing is, people often ask us, okay, well, how do you go back into normal schooling if you're not registered and they don't have the history? Well, you go back the same way you would if you came from New South Wales to Western Australia. Those two states don't talk to each other. They don't pass on any information. They basically put your kids in, they assess how they're going at the year level they're supposed to be at, and then they make the judgment call on whether they stay on that level or they change year levels. So basically what will happen if we ever go back to Australia is that the government will just go back into a normal school, and then they will do an assessment on what level they think they should be at, and then they're back into the normal school system. Now, I don't know how it works in other countries. That's just how it works in Australia. And I've done a lot of research on this because I was very scared that we're going to pull our kids out of school and then we'd get in trouble. But because we're not in any state, we don't have to register anywhere, if that makes sense. And it's been 2 years now and not a single government entity has come to us and asked us what we're doing. So clearly, if you're not in a state, you're not their problem. And that's the way it sort of works. So because of that, it allows us to educate our kids the way we want to educate them. Whereas if you're in Western Australia, you have to get a person to approve that from the education system. They have to prove the way you're teaching, which is a good thing, obviously, because homeschooling and schooling like this gets a bad rap. And a lot of that's got to do with the parents not putting in effort. And I think if there's a parent watching this and they're not 100% sure whether they're comfortable or like whether they're ready to teach their own kids, all I would say is that if you care about your children, which you obviously do, and you put in the effort, as a parent, knowing that the computer just can't teach them everything, you've got to be there actively helping and assisting and make sure they understand and like identifying where the gaps are and just being close and present and then making the most of opportunities, learning opportunities outside of the computer, then you'll be fine. One of the biggest benefits of this homeschooling and teaching them ourselves is they become very, very good self-learners. If they don't know something, they go and find the answer themselves, which is something that school system doesn't really teach, that critical thinking. They're going, I can find the answer myself. So when they're playing like games on the Switch, if they don't know the answer, they just go and Google it and find the answer now. You know, kids generally learn that a lot later in life when they're forced to in high school. But our boys have been in this mindset that like, if you want to know something, that every answer you ever need is in front of you. You just got to go and find it. They've carried that into the real world. When they don't know the answer to something, they ask, which is amazing. And it allows us to give us opportunities to help make sure we fill in the gaps in their education. So that's how we do our education. You know, like I said, we've been at this for a few years now, so this is a pretty honed in process. But when we first start, it's completely understandable when you first start to not be comfortable doing it. That's just the path of the course. I don't think anyone is comfortable doing it when they first do it, but you realize that kids are way smarter than we give them credit for. They just need the right guidance to make sure that they reach their full potential. So that's how we do our education, guys. There's obviously more to the education, and we're going to talk about that in future videos. So make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you're interested in learning how we've checked out of the 9-to-5 grind and now living a life that we've always wanted to live, being together as a family and making an income online so that we can support that. So make sure to subscribe to the channel, and we'll catch you in the next video. And that's going to be on how we make sure that our kids have a good social rounding and don't become one of those weird homeschooling kids.